morning, this is Kelly from Germain Media for another edition of Stones and Bones. Today we are in Madison County with our good friend Steve Tweed, and we are here to see the burial site for the victims of the Shelton Laurel Massacre. Let's go check it out. It's up on this ridge. In 1863, Madison County was a county like much of Appalachia, torn apart between northern and southern forces in the Civil War. Madison County experienced a terrible tragedy called the Shelton Laurel Massacre, where 13 men and boys suspected of Unionism were captured by Confederate forces and executed. The men and boys were executed about 2-3 miles west from here, and then were carried in wagons to this place where they were buried in a mass grave on this ridgeline here.
It may not be true. The stone is there. So from when I was little and first discovered the stone because a childhood friend lived in a log cabin over here, the one stone suggested a mass grave. And then come to find out later, no, there's one stone. So whether it's actually a mass grave, I cannot swear to that. So you'll see when we get up here, they're buried all out the ridgeline. Different people are. And when they were captured, there were actually 15 of them, and 2 of them escaped, and one was he hated Confederate soldiers, and he went on a man-by-man killing spree, supposedly, even after the war, and then he wound up meeting a violent death some years later. His name was Pete McCoy.
Pete McCoy.
Pete McCoy. You can find some stuff on him on the web. It's interesting.
It was a dark and bloody time.
Yes, it was.
So besides this being the burial site, and we're not exactly sure where, if it was a mass grave or individual graves of the victims of Shelton Laurel Massacre, this was also Shelton family members were buried up along this ridge.
Yes.
And rather than in a group like in a traditional cemetery, they were put side by side all the way down the ridge.
Yeah, so the original home place stood right down here below this barn, which you can barely see through the trees. So, it was tradition, especially among the Irish, is that you would bury someone on a hill overlooking the homestead. You see that a lot. And I think this is also the case because the earliest Shelton member is buried on the other end of the cemetery, which at that time this hillside would have been clean. One of the interesting things about this cemetery, although I've seen it before, but it's prominent in this one, is that someone has come along at a later date. This was the original marker for the deceased, and someone came along and added these stones later because, grandma or grandpa remembered who was buried there and the life dates, or it was in the family Bible, and they put the stone up as a way of respect and remembrance. Okay, so what we have here are David Shelton, born about 1776, and his wife Catherine Miller Shelton, born about 1777. And to the best of my knowledge, although there are really good Shelton historians around here, this was the earliest Shelton settling family to Shelton Laurel. Got here, to my understanding, about 1799 or 1800. They were the first in this area, along with some of the other families, the Rays, the Chandlers, the Kings, but my family came about 20 years later. That we got here to Madison County about 1820.
So do you know anything behind the history of the Shelton Laurel Massacre?
Supposedly there was a raid on the Allen House in downtown Marshall, which still stands, and that was for Colonel Lawrence Allen of the North Carolina, I think, 64th Division. And he was gone away, obviously, in the war, and this was 1863. And his children were sick, and they both died in the aftermath, and he needed somebody to blame. And they raided salt, which salt was going for $100 a bag, from what I understand.
In 1863.
They were starving the Union sympathizers out. And so the salt raid happened, and so he needed somebody to blame, and he came to Shelton Laurel. They came to Shelton Laurel and gathered up 15 Unionists, and it was bad because they, from what I understand, they tortured women and everything to find out who was where. Told them that they were going to march them to Knoxville, is where they were going, to a prison camp, and they got, about 2 miles down the road, and they stopped them and they executed them. And a couple of the soldiers had issues with young David Shelton, who was 13 years old. He was pleading for his life, and they hesitated, and supposedly Keith told them, "By God, you shoot him, or I'll shoot you in his place." And that finished the 13. And that's the reason there was, I guess, a lot of hard feelings in this county for generations.
For generations, yeah. Something like that doesn't go away overnight.
It was a hard time. Men, regardless of which side they were on, fought for what they believed in, and it's over and done with. So let it go. Just pay your respects, and just remember the history. Let's don't do it again.
Well said. Very well said. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Stones and Bones in Madison County. We're kind of wandered down the ridge from Ashe County today. Steve, we really appreciate you bringing us out here and
Yes,
showing us this place. It's really fascinating.
Glad to do it.
I've heard of the Shelton Laurel Massacre for probably 30 years. So
Right.
to see the actual site where they were buried and the other members of the Shelton family was really, really kind of cool.
Yeah, it's definitely a somber time to come visit, but it's part of our history.
Absolutely. So hope you enjoyed that. We'll see you again next Monday on another edition of Stones and Bones.